One.
Hey, good evening, Chris. How are you?
I'm good, Dan. Great to see you. Always a pleasure.
Great to see you. And where are you coming to us from today?
I'm in Vermont, so I'm in my home here in Vermont, the great state of Vermont in the US. How about you? Where are you at these days?
I'm in Pittsburgh,
Wow.
Pennsylvania. Oh, by the way, I guess you have some news to share. You just got selected to voted for to elected office, if I'm
I
not
did.
mistaken.
I did. I'm now the High Bailiff of Orange County, Vermont. And so my responsibility is basically to take over for the sheriff in case they are in some way unable to perform their duties. And also, there's some leeway for me to have a little bit more oversight over the sheriff's department. And of course, to try to hopefully have a successful audit this year of the sheriff department's finances. So it's a great position. Happy to have it and thankful to the voters who trusted me to have this position.
Sounds great. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So this evening we're just going to have a little conversation about current events, mostly what's happening with regards to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with which both of us are very familiar with. We've both been to Russia recently. We've both been to the Donbass together. So um, this should be easy for us.
Absolutely.
So the first question that I have for you, Chris, is the number one topic right now in the Western press is the speech that Russian President Vladimir Putin recently gave. Some call it a quote warning to the West, unquote. Others call it a quote warning shot of World War III, unquote. What is your opinion, Chris, on that matter?
I think that it's a warning to the West. I think President Putin and the Russian Federation have been very sober in their assessment of the situation with their country and with the US, EU, NATO countries who are currently supporting the Kiev fascist regime. Um, Russia has been a very stable, secure power. It has not been belligerent in any way. And what it has tried to do is that it has tried to use diplomacy to the fullest extent to have a resolution to the ongoing situation, which did not start in 2022, as you well know. It started, of course, in 2014 and even earlier with the meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs by the United States and other Western countries. So I think that ultimately the recent news of the United States' support for the Ukrainian armed forces to use ATACMS and Storm Shadows, supplied both by the US and the UK, respectively, against the Russian Federation on the Russian Federation's territory is a grave escalation and a red line that the government in Russia has said repeatedly should not be crossed. So I think that this warning is ultimately, once again, a statement that the Russian Federation reserves the right to defend itself, its territorial integrity, and its national security, as any country does. And of course, that the West has to take Russia's security concerns seriously, which they have not since, of course, the liquidation of the USSR in the early 90s. And since then, we've seen NATO constantly expanding. So this is not a warning shot. This is not an escalation. This is simply saying if you want to attack us, we are going to proportionally respond. And since you're attacking us with weaponry that is also nuclear capable, we reserve the right to also respond with similar munitions. And that's what we've seen happen. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I totally agree. I mean, if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is exactly what President Kennedy said in the reverse situation, that if Soviet missiles were launched from Cuba, that he would treat those as being launched directly by the Soviet Union and that he would respond against the Soviet Union. And no one thought that was a crazy position to take. And obviously, the Soviet Union took that threat seriously, and that's in part why they were able to settle the conflict within 13 days. Of course, the difference now, unlike then, is that the two sides are not talking to each other. Certainly, the Biden administration has not talked to the Putin administration since the beginning of the SMO, almost 3 years ago. Now, it does appear maybe some folks in the incoming Trump administration are having some conversations, but that's really not the same thing, right? They don't have the authority yet. So
No,
that's a problem.
you're absolutely right. I think these are ongoing concerns. One of the things that I wanted to reference, of course, is this new Russian missile, the Oreshnik, which can carry a nuclear charge of hundreds of kilotons. We're talking about many times the magnitude of what we saw dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about 100 to 200 times as powerful. So, my question to you is, does Ukraine have a real chance to become a second Japan?
Well, I think so. I mean, and frankly, not just Ukraine. I think that Putin signaling this that a European country might be hit by this, possibly U.S. bases in the region, if, for example, in Poland, could be hit by this. I just saw, by the way, that the U.S. now has something like 47 bases in Scandinavia, which is just insane, right? I would think those would be possible targets. So this is a dangerous situation. I mean, none of us should be happy about this. All of us should be very concerned. As I understand, people were during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You always hear that, oh, the world held its breath and all the news was focused on it. And again, the difference today is no one seems to care. It's absolutely bizarre.
You're absolutely right. Actually, now that you bring up the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's important to note here that the Russian Federation has no uh, nuclear weapons in the Western Hemisphere. However, the United States has weaponry in Eurasia. So, near the border of the Russian Federation, the United States maintains nuclear capable bombers and short range, medium range, and long range missile systems, be they through submarine, the submarine launched ballistic missiles, or part of the nuclear triad are our F-35s, also our long-range strategic bombers, which are based in places like Italy, Turkey, and in other countries surrounding Russia. So when the Russian Federation sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, the United States was extremely upset about this. I remember when Mike Pompeo came out and he was livid about this. But somehow it's okay for the United States to have not only nuclear capable bombers, to have nuclear armed bombers in Europe next to Russia. You see the double standard here, and I think that it's important for people listening to understand the importance of the double standard and how the Russian Federation has been witnessing this for decades and finds it to be an intolerable solution. If you're going to have a set of rules, everyone has to follow those set of rules. But you can't have one set of rules for nuclear weapons next to us and another set of rules for nuclear weapons next to you. Just like you can't say that Kosovo being separated from Serbia is a good thing, and then when the people in Crimea and the Donbass vote for their independence, you say we don't recognize it. It's propaganda. You see these double standards and this hypocrisy, which the Russian Federation always calls out at the UN and other places.
No, those are very good points. Now, I will say I do think in response to all this, if I'm not mistaken, I did see a report that Russia might have sent a nuclear sub to the Caribbean, to the Cuba area. So they may have one nuclear capable device here in the hemisphere, but that's recent. That's in response to this whole conflict. So what do you think? What's the probability that in response to the use of nutshell, the West will deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine or allow Kiev to build a dirty bomb?
I think that there always remains a possibility because we have a lot of hawkish people in positions of power, especially within the military establishment and the national security establishment, that want to see the strategic defeat of the Russian Federation. This is a well-known fact, and it's clear, I think, to many analysts and people who've been following the ongoing escalations between NATO and the Russian Federation over the past decades that there is a real drive and desire not only to carve up the Russian Federation, but eventually to decapitate the Russian Federation's leadership and to install someone like Yeltsin again, somebody who's easily pushed aside so that the West can do its bidding in Russia. I think that they find it very difficult to do anything now because Putin is a strong leader and has the backing of the people who voted for him multiple times now. And I think that one of the great fears is that because of this situation, that the Americans or some officials will either overtly or covertly uh, give Ukraine the authority to either use these kinds of munition systems, even going beyond just ATACMS and Storm Shadow systems, or to give them the capabilities to build a dirty bomb that they can use in some sort of terrorist attack. And of course, this is the stuff of fiction. We know, for example, Tom Clancy's The Sum of All Fears, some dirty bomb or some small nuclear weapon that's used to try to create a situation of conflict between the Russian Federation and the United States. The problem is that now it's becoming more of a reality. And that's the real fear, is that this situation is spiraling without any real solution being offered by the West towards peace. The Russian Federation is clear that it wants a situation that can be resolved here with peace and with security for all parties. The United States isn't interested in that, and that's the real fear: is that somebody might do something that crosses a line that can't be taken back at some point. What do you
Yeah,
think?
well, that's the danger of nuclear war, and I fear I have those fears. And Biden's talking about possibly sending nuclear weapons to Ukraine, which, again, I just think, again, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy could not abide by that. There's no way in Cuba. There's no way Putin will abide by that in Ukraine. No way.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. And actually, it's really important that you brought up the fact that a nuclear capable submarine, has gone to the Caribbean, because one of the questions that I constantly ask myself is, if the situation escalates and if this this conflict is ongoing, why doesn't Russia deploy nuclear weapons to countries and allies like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba? Why wouldn't it go back to the original situation that was in the 60s and say, okay, we're going to defend the countries in this hemisphere from you. If you want to defend countries in our area, in our, sort of region, from us, right?
Well, I think you could see that happening. Again, that's how this tit for tat works. Again, if Russia did it, the U.S. really couldn't complain, given we've been doing it to Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think that that's a real possibility. Now, of course, though I say the U.S. shouldn't be able to complain, they will. They complain when China plans to build a peaceful port somewhere, like in Peru, which is 6,000 miles from the United States. There's no fairness exercised in the minds of the Western leaders. What's good for the goose is not good for the gander, right? And that is the problem. And now, of course, the rest of the world can't accept that. They can't accept these double standards, but the West lives by them, breathes by them. And I think so much so that they don't even see them as double standards. They lost the perception of that a long time ago.
Oh, I agree with you. And actually, it's interesting. This question for me is always a fascinating one, because I think the formula that the DPRK, that North Korea has used, has proven to be the correct formula. That is that we are a small nation. We want our own system. We've struggled hard against both Japanese imperialism and US imperialism. And so the only way to safeguard our revolution, our political system, our ideology, right? The pillars of Juche and Songun, is nuclear weapons, right? That is the key to their stability, because they saw what happened to Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who both had programs, didn't have those programs anymore, and then were ripe for the picking by the imperialist powers, who eventually went in there and destroyed the governments and occupied and killed hundreds of, almost over 1 million people in total in 2 decades of war. So I think that in this situation, if the Russian Federation is concerned about the stability, especially of some of its most important allies in the Western Hemisphere, the so-called, what is it, the Monroe Doctrine area, right? The area that only the U.S. is supposed to exercise control over. If Russia is concerned about the stability and safeguarding of those revolutions, of those systems, then the placement of nuclear weapons at the command of the Russians would be a form of stability, right? It would balance again the equation and deterrence. However, the United States is such a belligerent power My fear is that it would escalate the situation overwhelmingly because it cannot tolerate the fact that it does one thing, but another power can do something similar to it, especially in a hemisphere that it declared 2 centuries ago that it only has the right to control.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And of course, they seem to have now extended the Monroe Doctrine throughout the rest of the world
That's right.
insanely. So, if the West is concerned about Putin's threats to the UK and US in response to Kiev's use of long range weapons made by these countries, why do you think the West continues to push this issue? Why are they provoking Russia?
I think they're provoking Russia because deep down they don't want Russia to be powerful. They recognize that Russia for centuries has been one of the most important Eurasian powers. It, of course, saved Europe multiple times. We know it was a key architect in Napoleon's downfall through various victories and, of course, basically dragging Napoleon's army through the winter. In Russia, which of course decimated his army. It destroyed the Germans, right? It destroyed the Nazi war machine. And so they realized that they cannot control Europe and by that way project power into Eurasia without destroying the Russian Federation. They can try to isolate China, but Russia is so large, so vast. And by the way, it doesn't only border Europe, it has 3 nautical borders with the United States on the other side, right? Next to, in Alaska.
Right.
So,
With
of
the,
course,
yes.
a lot of students are always very perplexed. They said, "Wait, we have borders with Russia?" Well, of course we do, right?
Yeah.
We bought Alaska from them. Or, of course, some say now
Right.
we leased it, but we don't know. That's a historical debate that others can have. But I think that if the West was serious about peace, they would recognize Russia as a equal power and a partner for peace and stability and development. But they don't. They see Russia because they need to have an enemy. That's the only way that the military industrial complex can churn. It's the only way that our politics, which are built on war and on fear, it's the only way that those politics can really continue. Because if you're not focused on an external enemy, then you got to focus on the internal problems, which are numerous, as you well know, in the United States. So, of course, I don't think that the West, the United States, the UK, other European powers are interested in peace. They're interested in seeing Putin gone. They're interested in seeing a weak Russia and a Russia that ultimately can be carved up. Let's not forget that what they did to Yugoslavia is what some neocons and think tankers are salivating for the Russian Federation. They'd like to see the separation of Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, this part, that part, and to turn Russia into 80 small little countries that they can have tremendous control over. But this won't happen. I mean, the Russian government will never tolerate it, and the Russian people don't want it. They are proud of their country, they're proud of their history, and ultimately the West, through all of its actions, continues to prove that it is not a partner for peace, but a partner that wants to perpetuate war.
Yes. And again, imagine if Russia was openly saying it wanted to break the United States up into 50 different countries or whatever. Um, we would find that both preposterous and anger provoking at the same time. The other thing people have to think about, since we're talking about interesting geography issues, is the state of Kaliningrad, which is in the middle of Europe. It's part of Russia, and I believe that's because of a deal made after World War II. But if you look at it on the map, you realize Russia, through that state, is right smack dab in the middle of Europe, which is quite interesting. I've never been to Kaliningrad, but I don't know if you've been, but sounds like an interesting place. So,
Oh no, absolutely. And I've been near it. I have not had the opportunity to go in it, but of course this is Russian Federation territory. And of course, some Europeans have even advocated for, now that this war is ongoing, just to invade and kick out Russia from that territory, which is
right,
absolutely insane. But people have commented on it because they don't like the fact that Russia is there.
right, right.
It's very interesting to see on that. Let me ask you, because we're just had a very important election here. We've gone through it
Yes.
together. Let's talk about the Democrats. Of course, the Democrats couldn't leave office nicely or easily or peacefully. Towards the end of the Biden term, what have they done? They've ramped up situation with the Kiev, and did the U.S. still allow Kiev to hit targets on Russian territory with long-range Western weapons? And why would they do that? What do you think the rationale is for this?
Well, I think there's two explanations, two or three explanations for it. I mean, I think the Biden administration is so wedded to the conflict in Ukraine that it wants to ensure that conflict will continue into the Trump administration, despite Trump's some noises by Trump, though he hasn't been completely consistent on this. He's not completely consistent on anything, but he has made some noise he wants to settle that conflict. Well, there is a thought, of course, that what Biden is doing is poisoning the well to make that impossible because they want the conflict to continue. Now, I've heard other theories saying, well, actually, Trump, despite some of his rhetoric, wants to continue the conflict, and Biden is kind of working behind the scenes to help Trump be able to do that. So that's an interesting theory. I don't know if I buy that one. I think I'm more towards the first theory, that they want to make sure that Trump, who at least let's at least concede is a question mark, won't be able to end the conflict very easily. The other is, the other theory at least intrigues me, but I think there's not a lot of evidence for that. Anyways, I guess I said there were a few reasons, but those are the two main ones. How about, what do you think?
I agree. I think it's trying to poison the well. I also think it's trying to create chaos and sow division within the Trump administration on their way in, because Trump was adamant that he could figure out a deal within 24 hours, that he could solve this ongoing war in Europe. And of course, now with this situation, it seems more remote and unlikely that Trump will be able to solve it that quickly. And so I think that the Biden administration is trying to dig the knife even deeper into the Trump administration's back, and basically saying, now you're stuck with this and you have to get out of it. And to get out of it, it's gonna take a lot, because so many red lines have been crossed. Trust has to be built. It doesn't take 24 hours. It might take months, if not a year or two into his administration, to finally resolve this. And
Right.
there's going to have to be multiple levels that people are going to have confidence building measures to really believe that the U.S. is committed to peace and committed to a resolution, a just resolution here in Ukraine and in the region. So I think that definitely this has been a poisoning wells scenario. It's also been, I think, a crude way to get back at the president-elect, who won with the popular vote and with the electoral college. And the Biden administration just has to accept the fact that people voted for Trump, not only for the economy, but to end the wars and to end the funding of these wars, where over $150 billion of taxpayer dollars has been funneled to the Kiev regime, including in cash and in armaments and other aid. I think that's unacceptable. I think that's unacceptable when Americans are suffering. And some Americans this holiday season, we're now in the Thanksgiving period, some Americans are going hungry. Many Americans are on the streets. And we have epidemic of drug abuse, of crime, and of loneliness in this country. It's a real tragedy, ultimately.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what do you think, Chris? Do you think there will be a change in policy in the new Trump administration regarding Ukraine and Russia, even in terms of rhetoric or policy? What do you think?
It's my hope, and I think it's a lot. A lot of people had hope that if Trump won the election, that he would surround himself with some people who were more sensible when it came to policies towards Russia, and more sensible about the United States' relationship with the Russian Federation, as well as with other countries. I think it has been a mixed bag, to say the least, and to kind of leave it at the best, because some people that have been chosen are in fact quite hawkish and antagonistic, not only towards Russia, but towards other countries that Russia is friendly with. For example, Marco Rubio, who's been tapped for Secretary of State. He might, for example, say, okay, we need to find a solution in Ukraine, but he's very antagonistic towards especially towards Latin America. We know Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but also towards China and the DPRK
Hmm.
and Iran.
Yes.
So we have some real concerns here because it depends on if they can separate Russia, Ukraine from the other ongoing issues worldwide, which I don't believe they can. I think you got to take it as a package deal because all of them in some way are interconnected. And we know that many of these countries, the so-called axis of evil or troika of tyranny or whatever kinds of terminology and phrase mongering that they like to do, I think that they have to recognize that many of these countries are allies of one another now and are going to hopefully stand up for one another. And so I think that if the Trump administration is really committed to peace, which I hope it is, we haven't seen the fruits yet. We don't really know what's going to happen. I think there's a camp that is for peace and for better relations with Russia. I also think there is a camp that's much more hawkish and antagonistic, especially the old hardliners of the Cold War, or people who quote unquote suffered under communism or whatever they like to whatever mythology they like to use. Um, I think there's real concern that they will try to escalate the situation. So I'm hopeful. I remain cautiously optimistic, as I like to say, but I think we have to be prepared, as you've rightfully pointed out earlier, that we have to be prepared to continue our activism and our work towards peace, towards understanding, and ultimately towards ending imperialism altogether and focusing on American workers and farmers and people at home.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with you that, it may be, I think sadly, the U.S., as currently constituted, is currently led, will always be at war. It's a matter of what theater they're going to focus on. And I think the Republicans do seem more focused on China. The Democrats are much more focused on Russia. But it really, for the electorate, is like the decision of whether you want to die by drowning or hanging, right? War is going to be there again, unless we organize and build a movement against that. So
I agree with you. I agree with you. Let me ask you, how did Trump's election affect Zelensky's negotiating appetite, quote unquote? Can we say that the Ukrainian president is really ready to settle for less?
it seems that there's some signs that he is. I think there was a Washington Post article, in fact, from the today or yesterday, saying that Zelensky may be ready to sign a deal in which, for example, he would give up some land because he is afraid that again, Zelensky doesn't know what Trump's going to do. None of us do. But again, Trump has made a lot of noise that he wants to end this. He wants to end it within 24 hours. And Zelensky may feel he's got a better negotiating hand under Trump. I'm sorry, under Biden than he does under Trump.
Hmm.
And that he wants to possibly settle things now. So, yeah, I think that probably has made him more eager to make a deal. I think the other thing that has as well is, of course, Russia's use of this Oreshnik, and Russia's overall successes on the front, I think, are also leading Zelensky to want to possibly end this. I saw a poll today that Zelensky's popularity has dropped to 22%. And so that's not a guy who can feel secure in his situation for many reasons. But number one being that his people are not interested in him anymore. And if Trump, the incoming U.S. president, isn't interested either, he's in a very bad shape. So
I agree, and actually, some of us, as you rightfully pointed out, there have been some articles, even some people online saying maybe we're going to expect a Christmas surprise or some sort of Christmas truce, like in World War One, where everybody gets together and okay, it's a holiday time, let's have a cessation to the battle. I think that's hopeful thinking, wishful thinking, a bit utopian. I don't and idealistic. I don't really see it at this point. I think that. Even some have argued that maybe even Zelensky will be cooed out from his
yeah,
position by hardliners. I think that that's a possibility. I wouldn't be surprised. And of course, with his lower popularity now, he's basically at the rock bottom at this point. He doesn't have a mandate really to lead and especially to lead Ukraine not only in the war but especially in negotiations. So that's a real concern at this point as to what the what Zelensky's ultimate goals will be at the end of the Biden administration and in the Trump administration. I don't think he's going to get what he wants in either administration, because I think
Right.
both administrations, I think number one, Biden wants basically all the Ukrainians to die down to the last one to try to defeat Russia, whereas Trump could care less about, Zelensky's territorial concerns. All right, end it here and that's it, finished.
Right.
So we'll see ultimately what that looks like. I'm not sure what it's going to end up, turning out to be. We might also have to contend with the fact that we might be in a war for a prolonged period of time. This might be a war of attrition that lasts a few more years. We might, for example, have multiple ceasefires that could be broken, especially by belligerent groups like Azov or other neo-Nazi forces that operate, sometimes independently. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen on the ground, and especially how this relationship will get settled between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and what Ukraine's place will be in Europe and with Ukraine's aspirations for NATO. These are all the big questions that are still not solved.
Yes. Yeah. No, and there's precedent for that idea of these conflicts kind of lasting a long time, sometimes in a very low intensity way, and then higher intensity. Look at what's happening in Syria now. We thought that conflict was largely over. Now that's starting to fire up again. But again, I think there's Western forces that are doing that on purpose. And again, I think they'd be willing to do that within Russia's sphere of influence too. Since we're running out of time, I'll take the last issue, and that is the question about, Russia, I believe, has prosecuted this war in the way that it has to try to limit civilian deaths, to try to limit the destruction of civilian infrastructure. And even now it's saying it will warn the Ukrainian population if it uses one of these, supersonic missiles again. And I do think, in the end, what this does show is and I think you and I have experienced this and heard this from people when we were in Russia and the Donbass, that they understand this war is between Russia and the West, the collective West, more than it is a war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is just a proxy for that war. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's what I see.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And I think that we've seen that. Look at just a year of war, a year of genocide in Gaza, and what the Zionist military has done there, what the state of Israel has done. And you can see they have destroyed nearly every structure. Russia has a much larger air force and much greater capabilities. They could have leveled entire cities, but the Russian Federation is not interested in what the Washington Post and New York Times says is conquest for land. Russia has tremendous land. It doesn't need more land. It is concerned with civilians. It is concerned with having a Ukraine that is peaceful, that is independent, but that is also neutral, that will not pose a threat to the national security of the Russian Federation. And since we had that coup, of course, Russia's concern has been the meddling, as you rightfully pointed out, of the West using proxies in Ukraine. And so that's
Yes.
that's why the targets have been military targets. There has not been widespread damage of civilian infrastructure. The targets, especially of these hypersonic weapons, have been military facilities, military complexes, and also, military formations on the battlefield, right? So I think that we can understand that Russia is not a belligerent power, is not an occupying power, is not a power committed to genocide or anything like that. Russia is a very calm, cool, and collected power that really emphasizes and prioritizes military victories with the least amount of casualties possible. They want to ensure that they are fighting the forces that are the real evil, and that is why Putin called for denazification and also called this a war of aggression by the West on the Russian Federation. So it's not targeting civilians. In fact, Russia sees these civilians in Ukraine as fraternal people, as part of the historic nation. They were all together in one country,
Yes.
right? For
Yes.
how many centuries? So I think it's really important to understand this and for people to get it across that Russia is not interested to exterminate Ukrainian identity or Ukraine off the map or anything like that. Russia has said repeatedly it is interested in a stable, secure, and ultimately neutral Ukraine that respects Russia's security interests. And until that happens, the Russian Federation will be forced to confront the West's ongoing meddling in Ukraine's affairs.
Yes. Well, this has been great, Chris. You're always, you're awesome as always. I appreciate your insight. And I hope you're willing to do this again sometime, have this kind of discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for your ongoing work. We really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. You too, Chris. All right. Good evening.
Good evening.